To say that this chart has haunted me more than any other in my life is probably an understatement. Because what this is an academic chart of an asset bubble. And if you do any reading on asset bubbles, what you'll discover very quickly is that all asset bubbles are psychological in nature, which is to say that it's part of a thinking process, which is to say we all use kind of the same process in our lives. If you've ever had a failure, lost a business, failed relationship, a marriage, lost a job, if you track your experiences, you'll probably track and find that they'll do this thing at the top that's called the delusional phase and a new paradigm, and it creates a small collapse. You change some of the behaviors that are causing the problem, but don't acknowledge that there are other behaviors causing the problem as well. And so you go from peak mania, from peak mania into your first crash, and you think you've solved it. And then the behaviors begin to remanifest. And you end up with what's called a return to normal phase. And then in that normal phase, you begin manifesting the same mistakes you made before, which lead to the ultimate collapse. And in the collapse area here, the one part that's important to note is what's called capitulation. And capitulation means the moment that you give in. Capitulate. When I first came across this chart, it was in relation to an economic collapse. And I tried to get people to take a look at this chart and to look at the stock markets and to note the similarities that I saw. And so if you knew me during these years and you're going, Bob, why were you so stinky? And the answer was that I saw so many similarities in these charts that I comprehended what came next. I didn't get the time right, and I didn't have enough understanding under my belt to know what that meant exactly. But that's why this chart's important, was because as soon as I began to interact with this chart and this information, I became what's called consciously incompetent. I realized that there was something that I didn't know, and I began to study on it. And, one of the things that I find most amazing in my research is not just the synchronicity of the information, but the parallel nature of the information. Back in the 1860s, a guy by the name of McKay famously said in a book about bubbles, right, that men go mad in herds and only come to their senses slowly and one by one. And if I had to characterize the pace of subscriptions on my other YouTube channel, it would be that people are slowly coming to their senses one by one. And I'm grateful for those numbers, and I do expect someday that these ideas that are in there, the Venus cataclysm and such, will have wide social acceptance. And so the question then becomes, how does that and an asset bubble relate, Bob? And the answer is that I spent the next 2 years, right, just trying to get a handle on where we were and what we were doing. And what I had thought was an asset bubble about to pop was actually just an asset bubble turning a corner. And so one morning, I was laid off, as I've said. And it was quite devastating. In fact, GE, now Genworth at the time, GE Financial, now Genworth Financial, you can actually see the day that they announced the layoffs in this cratering moment here. And it was in the few hours after that where I broke down just into deep tears. And that was the first drop in my collapse. Because, you see, years later, I realized, and this is actually quite functional, that when I began to look at the asset bubble from a psychological standpoint, I was able to look at my life and see these patterns. And more importantly, you can look at the world and see these patterns. And all these patterns are psychological. They're all a way of thinking about things. And we can change the way we think about things. We don't have to have a mania phase. We don't have to have a blow-off. We don't have to have a giant capitulation. We can choose. And so that collapse can happen at any time. It doesn't necessarily mean that the opportunity always exists. But when the opportunity exists, we should take that opportunity to collapse as many of our unsuccessful, of our challenged paradigms as possible. Because in doing so, we're following the basics of a Fibonacci sequence. I heard this said once. The Fibonacci sequence is simply take what you just did, take what you had, and create something new. And that's all a collapse really is. You take what you had, you take what you just learned, and then you create something new. And that's what I'm hoping that we choose to do, is to create something new. The idea of a crash is disruptive if you don't understand why they're happening and the necessity of them. But in some future videos, I'll talk more about becoming consciously competent, because that fall, after being laid off, I sat down one morning and I decided I was going to write a book. And I was going to tell everybody how smart I was by gathering all the data on a day-to-day basis and writing it into a journal. And so I began sharing some of that. If you look at things as a lesson, if you look at things as an opportunity to become aware of what's going on, what brings me the most pause is that I know my collapse isn't done. I know yours isn't. I know the world's isn't. For some reason, I feel like we're all in this together. We're all on the same path. Because this is extant. You can depend on this. I hope you guys enjoyed this week's music. And I'm going to take a week off, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Peace.
A blaze, still you don't feel the heat. It takes all you got just to stay on the beat. You say it's a living, we all gotta eat. But you're here alone, there's no one to compete. If mercy's a business, well, I wish it for you. Just ashes when your dreams come true. Fire, fire on the mountain. 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 Long distance run.